Well, welcome everyone to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything we talk about is aimed at helping you lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in these anxious times. My name is Irvine, and today, as always, I am joined by my co-host and collaborator, Bridget Tyre. Bridget, how are you doing? And this is a rather special episode, so why don't you tee up what the listeners are going to experience today?
Thank you, Irvine. Yeah, I am doing very well. Definitely excited because today's episode is a bit of a departure for us from all of our other episodes. This is our first time ever welcoming a guest. Her name is Kathleen Smith, and she's the author of 2 books, Everything Isn't Terrible, which was out in 2019, and her new book, True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop Pleasing Others and Start Being Yourself. She's also an associate faculty member of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family, and she teaches Bowen Family Systems Theory to leaders all over the globe, and she does it exceptionally well. And we are delighted to have her. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Kathleen.
Thank you for having me. It's quite an honor to be guest number 1. No pressure at all.
You just need to be perfect.
Shut down the experiment after you have me.
Yeah, you'll know how it went if we have another guest on.
Yeah, all the other guests are out there like really wishing you well because, this could be it.
Oh, goodness. Well, before we dive into the meat and your new book, which I am just devouring and enjoying, we'd love to hear, and I'm sure our listeners would, a little bit about you, Kathleen, and you're a therapist, and we're curious what inspired you to go into that work, and what do you love about it?
Yeah, so I feel like I've always been kind of what I would call a guidance counselor at heart. I always want to know what people's hopes and dreams are and what their 5-year plan is. And my friends sometimes get annoyed by that because they don't always have an answer for me. But I really just love sort of shifting past small talk and really hearing about people's challenges and what they want to do with them. And so I never get tired of helping people think about that. And I also, like a lot of people who are therapists or clinicians, my mom died when I was in college, and that was a really significant moment in my life. And a lot of the helpers that were important to me, and they weren't necessarily therapists, but really made me think about whether that was something I wanted to do also. And that also got me interested in how families deal with challenges. And so I was kind of on the fence coming out of college in between sort of going into ministry, actually, and being a counselor. And I decided the latter was sort of a better fit with what was interesting to me. And I haven't gotten tired of it so far. So, it's good work.
And I'm curious, Kathleen, what have you noticed changed? Like the world, we always talk about the world is changing, the challenges for leaders are changing. I'm just curious, as a therapist sitting in a seat there listening, what are you noticing and what has changed?
Well, the anxiety has gone up. There are a fefew things that have happened. When you said my last book came out in 2019, I was thinking about everything that's happened since 2019, right?
Yeah.
You got the stress of the world, and then you have I think, decline in confidence in a lot of institutions, which makes leaders anxious, for many good reasons. And so how things will kind of shake out remains to be seen. But I think there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of look towards people to kind of be these gurus who are going to tell them how to fix everything, right? That can feel good in the moment, but I don't know how helpful it is for folks. So I've just noticed that it's harder than ever to sort of define and trust your own thinking in these times as a leader.
Yeah, that's so true.
I love that phrase. I just want to underscore that, how it's hard to define our own thinking in these times. Yeah, it sure is.
Powerful. So Kathleen, now you say that you're a Bowen-trained therapist, and we have talked quite a bit on this podcast about Bowen theory and also the work of Ed Freeman, especially when it comes to leadership and organizations. But not every listener is versed in that. And so I'd just love for you to share a little bit with our listeners about Bowen theory and how might it inform your work as a therapist?
Yeah, so Bowen theory comes from a guy named Dr. Murray Bowen. He was a psychiatrist who was interested in turning human behavior into a science. He was very curious about why some families, or you could even say groups, functioned better than others, and how a lot of our behaviors we tend to label as dysfunctional are actually quite adaptive. They serve a purpose. And so if we could look to nature, we can look to animals and other sort of systems and think about sort of how maybe as humans we aren't that unique. Most of the time we're driven by our emotions, we're acting automatically, right? We're just trying to keep things calm and steady. And he was curious about how people, first of all, were able to observe their own functioning and how they were able to do something about it. Could you be a little bit more thoughtful in your relationships and how you operated day to day? Could you not be so hard on yourself and others when you do what humans do, right? And so I found that was very useful for me to think of human behavior that way. I think it took some of the pressure off, helped me not be so hard on myself or fool myself into thinking that I could make other people do what I wanted them to do. And so, yeah, it's just been a useful framework for me in thinking about, the challenges we face.
Yeah, I really love that because I think we do put a lot of pressure on ourselves and really, the wisdom of the human person. And actually, we really are more adaptive than we think we are. And there's a lot of predictability, really, in the chaos of this world. There's a lot that we can predict about our behavior.
Yeah. And one thing we can predict is that trying to get other people to do what we want them to do isn't going to work. And yet we keep trying it. That's also predictable.
So, Kathleen, now you mentioned right at the beginning, I asked that question, what's changed? And you talked anxiety and the rise of anxiety. And we talk a lot about, anxiety, the importance of leaders managing their own anxiety and being careful that they don't infect their teams with that anxiety. And so I know that was one of the core principles of Bowen as well. So just share with us, what did Murray Bowen have to say about anxiety and how it shows up?
Yeah, so I hesitate too much to speak for Murray Bowen, but from my understanding, at least in Bowen theory, the definition that he used for anxiety was our response to a real or imagined threat. And that can be the response of the individual or the response of the group or the system, right?
Sure.
And that a lot of what we do is born out of an attempt to manage that anxiety or maybe pass it along to a different point in the system. And some of that's helpful, but how do we get stuck in those ways of managing it? And then how does the group or the organization become less flexible, less creative, because we're putting all our energy towards keeping things calm? But I'd also add that anxiety can be a great driving force to motivate us to act or do things or solve problems, right? So, or if we are moving in the right direction, if we're growing up a little, if we're progressing, we experience a great deal of anxiety. So it's not necessarily a sign that something is wrong.
Yeah.
It might just mean we're in kind of unfamiliar territory. So I try and hold that in my brain as well. It's not necessarily a symptom that something is wrong.
Yeah, I think that's such a challenge for us because anxiety doesn't feel good. So we want to get rid of it. But it does have obviously a very useful purpose in our lives, or we wouldn't have it all these many years, right? It's just something that is a life force, kind of how we talk about it on the podcast. So I noticed, Kathleen, when I got your first book, Everything Isn't Terrible, the thing that really struck me is that you have a gift for translating theoretical concepts into these really lovely practical nuggets that make sense to people, whether they've heard of Bowen theory or not, whether they're in therapy or not, or ever have been. And I find your writing very accessible. So I thought it might be fun to ask you the question that if you were like sitting at a bar and having a beer with somebody and the person next to you overheard you talking about, Bowen theory, and they said, "Excuse me, what are you guys talking about?" If you could only share with that person like a couple of nuggets that would be practical that they could hear, what might you pick?
That's a hard question.
I know, because there's so many good nuggets.
Yeah. I mean, one I think of, and this has been helpful for me in thinking about the concept of differentiation of self, and which is a mouthful in Bowen theory, is how do you be connected to people without giving in to pressure or giving up on the relationship? How do you be in relationship with somebody without accommodating or adjusting, or without avoiding, I guess is another way of putting it, that third way. And that's been a helpful way for me to think about the real challenge of let's say, being a leader or being a human. To me, that's a pretty simple way of defining it. There's either the pressure for you to change, there's the pressure for the other person to change, or the temptation to not have anything to do with one another. And does that have to happen? Can you relate to somebody where nobody has to do the changing? That's not an easy thing. So that's one nugget of a way I kind of sort of describe it. I'm trying to think of another one. I mean, another one I talk about in the book is the sort of the anxious patterns. I call them the A's. And there's lots of different ways of categorizing these. And it's not the traditional way in the theory, but I talk about how we accommodate, how we act out, or how we avoid. And sometimes just having those kind of literary devices is helpful for me, and I think helpful for my clients, and remembering sort of, if you're not paying attention, what do you do? And people can say, oh yeah, I acted out today, or I accommodated and gave in to this person and did something I didn't think was right, or I just avoided them altogether, and that was helpful for me to pay attention to it. So those are a couple of kind of devices. I don't know if that's what you were getting at or not, but
those are great. Yeah. I love what you started with, which is how can we be in relationship with others without giving in or without giving up on the relationship. Boy, isn't that a challenge of a lifetime? It's such a balance there, and really, really just a helpful little nugget for me. I'm curious about how being so deeply trained in this wonderful theory and being a therapist who gets to apply it and help people, how does it end up helping you personally in your own relationship systems? Because that's got to be a perk, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think about what I said before. It helps me not be so hard on myself. It doesn't erase the anxiety. I'm sad to note. I was in a meeting the other day, and I spoke up about something I thought was important. And there was a piece in my mind that was like, don't say it, just leave it alone. You don't want to get into the middle of this. And I felt tremendously anxious for about let's say 24 hours afterwards. But I was able to say to myself, that's anxiety, that's progress. I stand by my thinking. I think it was useful to communicate to the group. But boy, that does not mean the feelings necessarily change, if it's not something you usually do. To me, that's good news, bad news, that bad news, you're still human, and doing something you don't normally do doesn't feel great. But good news is you don't maybe hem and haw as much over whether it was the right choice based on other people's reactions, right? It's more coming from a place of oneself and what you think is that sort of the next thoughtful thing. So I'd say it's helped me recognize sort of the next frontier for myself and what I need to work on with my own functioning. Mm-hmm. And B, it helps me not be kind of scared off by the anxiety that generates.
Yeah. I'm kind of still hooked on, Bridget, your idea of going to the pub with Kathleen and having like a Bowen theory night. I think, this could catch on. But with that in mind, I'm always curious, Kathleen. So I've been using concepts from Mary Bowen in coaching and in training, I would say maybe about 10 years. And I'm always surprised, especially in a coaching relationship, we'll meet a client. Like I get coming to mind like a few months ago, I was meeting a client, and clearly she was over functioning. And the concept and the description of it gave this powerful door for her to walk through to really understand her behavior and the behavior of what was happening in the system around her in just a new way. And it always strikes me, and that happens a lot. And so they are such transformative ideas. And so I'm just curious because, you're immersed in this work as well. And yet it catches me, the public are not really aware of this. You really don't hear about this. And I'm just curious about any thoughts about why that might be and why these theories haven't really caught a wider audience.
Well, I think, largely because of the way, let's say like in the therapy world, but I think also maybe in the kind of the consulting world as well, there's a lot of focus on sort of who the identified patient is and who the person is who needs to do the changing. And there's a lot of focus put on that person or individual or group, right?
Yeah.
There's less thinking on, well, maybe if any person was willing to volunteer to work on themselves, this whole thing would operate, as I said earlier, with a little bit more flexibility.
Yeah.
That requires, I think, a level of curiosity that is hard to have when you're really in crisis or when the anxiety is up. All of the focus is on how do I get rid of these symptoms?
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily talking about like mental health symptoms. It can be symptoms of sort of breakdown and functioning in like an organization as well. Or the focus is on how do we choose the next perfect leader versus how do we operate in a way that gives somebody a chance to not get, snuffed out, so to speak, based on how we're operating, right? It takes a lot of interested people to kind of take that on. And so I think it's a challenge because, so much of the models of fixing are focused on these symptoms, right? Or on one particular person. And that's how the system is managing the stress, right? So if you take that away, then, the things might get even more tense. And so I think people are very receptive to it. I just think there's a lot of noise, especially in the economy as well, of this is going to fix it. I have the solution, right? In hard times, we're all very susceptible to that sort of and line of a pitch, let's say. Yep. Whereas Bowen theory is about you sort of finding your own best way. That's less appealing to us, right? Yeah. We want to be told what to do and what's going to fix everything. We don't want to be told it's a lifelong process. It's a terrible business model.
Goodness. Yeah. You know what that reminds me of? And Irvine, you and I have both had this experience, I'm sure many times, is like a leader will come to us looking for coaching or consulting and some answers. And a lot of times it's couched as my team is the problem and I need you to fix my team. And the bad news we have to deliver is, well, you're always playing a role in whatever results you have. So let's start with you. That's not a message that initially people might welcome, although eventually they see, oh yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah.
And I love, Kathleen, as well. The other thing, we are such a quick fix society. And, the amount of times I'm sure all of us have been approached by organizations, leaders, people, kind of like, well, can I do this in 2 sessions? And, or kind of, I do a lot of work in emotional intelligence and like, well, can we fix the team in like with 2 sessions? No, absolutely not. This is going to take work. There is no easy path, and self-growth is difficult. Mm-hmm. So Bridget has mentioned you are the author now of 2 books. The first, and I love your titles. I don't know how you come up with your titles, but they're fantastic. The first one is Everything Isn't Terrible. And the second book, which is coming out in July this year, is True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop Pleasing Others and Start Being Yourself. Now, we've all written a book here. And if there's one thing I think that Bridget and myself, we've talked about this, is that it is a labor of love. Because it's a lot of effort and a lot of thought goes into it. And so I'm just curious, Kathleen, where did this new book come from? What inspired you? Who are you hoping to reach? Kind of what tell us a little bit about the process you went into and what you're hoping to achieve with the new book.
Yeah, so I think I would say the book is for humans because it uses Bowen theory, which is for everyone. But I was really focused on sort of, as a society, as things have gotten more stressful, how much more quick we are, as I said earlier, just now, to kind of borrow answers, to borrow solutions. I know observing myself, the more content I consume is a pretty good metric for how anxious I am. It's not that content can't be useful, but it's paying attention to how you use it and apply it in your life. Am I just listening to, let's say, productivity podcasts because I don't want to do my work? Or am I listening to them because I want to be more productive, right? Often it is the former, if I'm really being honest with myself, right? And so I really wanted to kind of write a book for people who are just so quick to kind of borrow answers from people and who are quick to give answers to people and kind of overfunction for them in that way. There's all of this borrowing and lending of self, as it's called in Bowen theory, that happens day to day if we start to pay attention. And how does a person begin to kind of dial that back a little bit. In the book, I use the analogy. I don't know if you guys ever saw the game show Supermarket Sweep.
Yes.
It was on like cable TV in the 90s. There may have been an earlier version a couple decades before, but basically on the game show, these people race through the studio grocery store and are trying to cram as many things into their shopping carts and get them back. And then they total them up, and whoever has the highest dollar amount wins. And it's a very simple premise, right? But I think of that sort of what we are often doing when we are anxiously looking for solutions without even stopping, and saying, do I think that this is the best thing for me or the best way forward? Let me put this back on the shelf, or we're gathering all these different measures of success that aren't true to us, or we don't actually want to put our energy towards, if we're honest. But it's just like society or social media or our family says it's important, so therefore it should be important to us, right? Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to write a book that kind of helped people pay attention to that, and also maybe dial back a little bit on it and ask themselves, maybe I sit down as a parent and think about what I believe and am trying to do before I read 20 books on parenting. Or maybe I sit down and work with somebody and think about what I'm trying to do as a leader before I read 50 books on leadership, right? How do you add a little bit of self to the process of working through problems is a really interesting question to me.
That's a great question. And what occurs to me as I'm listening to you is that doing that requires two things that are in short supply these days: time and reflective space, right? To really think for yourself requires both of those. But lots of the people listening right now spend their entire day on Zoom calls, back to back to back to back. There's precious little time for that. And yet it's so vital, so vital. I want to get into some of the really wonderful nuggets in this book, True to You. And in the introduction, by the way, I open up the book, I start reading it, and I was literally underlining everything on the first page. I'm like, this is going to be a long slog if I'm going to underline everything on every page. But here's one of the things I underline. You talk early on about how humans are built for relationships and that our brains are designed to, quote, read the room and follow the group. So that means we have this very deep focus on other people, right? And towards cooperation and keeping people happy and, all that kind of is nice. But then, as you said, a focus on keeping others happy is both an evolutionary gift and a superpower that can get us into trouble. Thought that was a great little nugget there. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So humans are social creatures. We're also mammals. And one of the ways many mammals survive is to get other people invested in us, right? And if you think about what does a baby do to keep its mother invested, it cries, right? That's the simplest example, right? But we benefit individually as a group when people care about us, when they think we know what we're talking about, when they're happy with us. That keeps things cooperative. It keeps things moving forward, right? If people weren't invested in us or what we had to say, we'd have chaos, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's just important to recognize that it's okay to want people to like you and be happy with you. That is not a bug, just a bug, right? Is also a feature. And also recognizing that the stakes are not as high as being tossed out of the group thousands of years ago and starving to death. Mm-hmm. That's how our brains react, right? As if it's that kind of threat, just because that's how they're built. But that is often not those are not the stakes, in an organization where somebody is upset with you. And also there's the reality that there are a million variables that affect how people respond to us and a million responses. If you do one thing to keep one person happy, then another person might not be happy about it. So good luck with that. And I think, it's a superpower that gets us into trouble is because we're so focused on reading the minds of others that and I talk about this in the book, we forget to know our own minds. Yeah. We don't take the time to access our own thinking. We're just saying, well, what does Bob think? Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of self in that. So that's that great challenge of being human, that balance of keeping people invested in you, but also operating out out of your own thinking. I mean, it's a challenge.
Yeah. Hard to believe that we're about to wrap up this episode now. There is so much in this book. We're actually going to record 2 episodes, but we want to bring this episode to an end. We're going to dive much deeper in the next episode. Kathleen, I'm just curious, just coming off that last point, do you have a little tidbit before we end this episode on how people might be more curious about staying in their own mind and kind of reflective? It's so difficult for us. Give us one tidbit before we go on how we might do that a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, I think about being able to ask yourself a couple of questions. First, just what have I been doing and how effective has it been? Creating the space to sit down and reflect on all the ways you're chasing after keeping other people happy or in line, right? And then also really taking I wish I had sort of a like sexier, more interesting way of telling people to do this, but literally carving aside the time to say, what do I think about this problem? What do I think is the best way forward? Can you give that 10 minutes? I mean, we're not talking about huge chunks of time here, you know? What theory or hypothesis do I want to test out? That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be right, but what do you believe in enough to put on that researcher hat and say, let's run this experiment, let's run this play and see what I can do with myself because I think I'm onto something here, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think that's different. That's not about having the answer. That's about having the research question, right? That takes the pressure off a little bit. And I think it makes people curious enough that they want to see what they can do. And so that's the question I always have for people is what's the theory you want to test out here? Mm-hmm. And I think that takes the pressure off.
Yeah. I love that. Sometimes I'll play with some of the clients that I work with, and I say, just pretend you're a scientist, put on a white coat, and you're not really invested in one answer, and just let your curiosity go and see what comes up. And it's all part of this wonderful unveiling of what might happen and might surprise you.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Kathleen, before we go, though, do you want to share with our listeners if they want to reach out to you or stay connected with you? Do you have any information to share with them in particular about your newsletter, which I know I'm a recipient of?
Yeah, so I write a Substack newsletter. It's called The Anxious Overachiever, which people can Google, or you can just go to my website, which is Kathleen Smith Writes, WRITES.com. And I have links to the newsletter there if folks want to check it out.
And I'll make sure that they're in the show notes as well if you want to look for those, and you'll get that information. Well, Kathleen, thank you for everything. We're excited for the second episode when we will actually next time jump even deeper into the book. And already you've given us some amazing insights and nuggets. We look forward to welcoming you on the show next time.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Bye,
listener.
everyone.